On June 20th, 1937, through low cloud and rain, a strange, red-winged aircraft appeared over Vancouver, Washington, where no one expected a Soviet plane to be. The men inside were exhausted, cold, short of oxygen, and running low on fuel. But they had done something no crew had done before. They had flown from the Soviet Union to America by crossing the North Pole in a single-engine aircraft. For more than 63 hours, that aircraft had moved through fog, ice, storm, darkness, and the enormous blank spaces of the Arctic. Every mile had depended not only on engineering, but on 3 men continuing to think clearly, while fatigue, cold, altitude, and uncertainty slowly worked against them. By the time they reached the American Northwest, the flight was no longer about records, prestige, or propaganda. It was about finding a runway before the sky collected its debt. To understand how they got there, we have to return to a Soviet runway before dawn, when the machine was still full of promise, and the crew had not yet learned what the Arctic intended to charge them. The commander was Valery Chkalov, one of the Soviet Union's most celebrated test pilots, bold, technically gifted, and exactly the sort of aviator a young state could turn into a legend. Beside him was Georgy Baidukov, a disciplined and highly capable pilot whose skill in blind flying made him invaluable once weather erased the horizon. The third man was Alexander Belyakov, the navigator, whose job was to guide them across a part of the world where the map offered little reassurance, and the view below could dissolve into featureless white. Their aircraft was the Tupolev Ant-25, a machine built around one ruthless design principle: sacrifice almost everything to range. It had one engine, enormous wings, and so much fuel capacity that it seemed less like a conventional aircraft than endurance given a metal body. The mission was simple to describe and extremely difficult to accomplish. Take off near Moscow, cross the Arctic, pass over the North Pole, continue across Canada, and reach the United States without landing. In the 1930s, that was not merely a long-distance flight. It was a direct challenge to weather, machinery, navigation, and the fact that the Arctic still punished confidence with unusual efficiency. Weather information was incomplete, radio support was limited, and near the pole, the magnetic compass could no longer be treated as a faithful servant. If the engine failed, or if the crew simply lost command of the situation, there would be no nearby rescue, no convenient airfield, and very likely, no second chance. The official Soviet version would later wrap the flight in slogans and great man rhetoric, but beneath that rhetoric there was something undeniably real. 3 men, 1 engine, and a route no crew had yet flown non-stop. Before dawn on June 18, 1937, the Ant-25 stood on the runway near Moscow, heavy with fuel and prepared for a journey. Chkalov later described the takeoff as one of the most dangerous moments of the entire flight, because a heavily loaded long-range aircraft does not leap into the sky, it has to earn it meter by meter. Rockets signaled the start, the engine gathered itself into a roar, and the red machine began its long run down the concrete strip. For several tense seconds, the whole mission came down to weight, acceleration, and the practical question of whether the runway was long enough. Then the Ant-25 slowly rose into the morning and turned north, carrying its crew toward a region where even minor problems had a habit of becoming serious. The first hours settled into a disciplined rhythm. 1 man flew, 1 man monitored systems or navigation, and 1 man tried to rest before his next turn came. Then the Arctic began to impose itself on the aircraft. Ice formed on the glass, on the wings, and on the propeller, while the engine vibration reminded the crew how little redundancy a single-engine flight really offers. They used anti-icing measures, changed altitude, and climbed through dangerous layers of cloud, solving each problem before it had time to mature into a catastrophe. Inside the cabin, the cold was relentless. Water froze, food froze, and even the simplest routines became awkward. At one point, after many hours in the air, the crew found that much of their food had frozen solid, including fruit that had to be thawed before it could even be eaten. Near the pole, where magnetic navigation itself became suspect, Belyakov had to rely on calculations, cross-checks, radio where possible, and celestial or solar observations whenever the sky allowed them. The cabin cold and altitude brought another layer of strain. Oxygen masks entered the routine, rest became poor, and the flight gradually shifted from an exercise in aviation to an exercise in endurance. Then came one of the most revealing crises of the flight: trouble in the engine water cooling system. A reserve fluid had frozen, the system was no longer behaving as it should, and the crew found themselves cutting open bags of drinking water and pouring what they could into the cooling system in order to keep the engine alive. It was the sort of moment that strips aviation of glamour entirely. 3 men in a freezing aircraft, far from help, trying to keep a long-range engine from dying with whatever water had not yet turned to ice. The culmination of the flight, however, was almost invisible. The North Pole, so dramatic on a classroom globe, offered no obvious sign that they had reached it. Only Belyakov's calculations told them what their eyes could not. They had crossed the top of the world. It was a triumph, but not a rescue, because the pole was not the end of the journey, only the point after which turning back had lost much of its meaning. After the pole, the Ant-25 turned south toward Canada, carrying a crew that was already tired, cold, and paying for every detour, climb, and headwind. The weather did not become more generous. Clouds still rose like walls, ice returned, and the aircraft was forced again into thin, punishing air. Chkalov later described the physical cost in blunt terms: nosebleed, a racing pulse, pain, and the exhausting labor of breathing at altitude. Heroism could keep a man at his station, but it could not replace oxygen, and by this stage the crew had an increasingly clear sense that the margin between success and failure was narrowing. They crossed northern Canada by glimpses, recognizing islands, rivers, lakes, and mountains whenever the clouds opened long enough. Each landmark mattered because it was evidence that Belyakov's numbers still corresponded to the earth beneath them. The original ambition had been to continue farther south, toward California, where a landing would have made for a cleaner and more spectacular finale. But by the time they approached the Pacific Northwest, the flight had become less romantic and more serious. Fuel was limited, oxygen was nearly exhausted, and the weather remained stubborn. Below them appeared the Columbia River, its bridges, the rain, and the military airfield near Vancouver, Washington. After more than 63 hours in the air, with Chkalov commanding the decision, Baidukov brought the Ant-25 down onto American soil. They had not reached California, and they had not achieved the neat ending a planner might prefer, but they had accomplished something better and less negotiable. They were alive. American soldiers and airmen hurried toward the machine, trying to understand how a Soviet aircraft had just emerged from the weather after crossing the Arctic. Chkalov reportedly asked for a wheel chalk in Russian, and for a moment, the first problem on American soil was not diplomacy, but translation. Soon the confusion became celebration. Reporters arrived, crowds gathered, and General George Marshall received the crew with the respect one aviator extends to another after a genuinely difficult feat. The Soviet state turned the flight into a symbol, as states tend to do, but the achievement itself did not depend on the slogans that surrounded it. Strip away the political decoration, and the essential story remains strong enough on its own. 1 aircraft, 1 engine, 3 men, and a route across one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The Arctic did not care what flag was painted on the wings. And the cold did not care what speeches would be made afterward. It only tested whether the men inside the machine could continue to think, continue to improvise, and continue to fly. For 63 hours over ice, cloud, ocean, and mountains, they did exactly that.